Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto. And for once, my guest is also in Toronto, which is unusual for him because every time I look for him, Walter Dorn is overseas someplace, and I have to go searching for him. But here he is in Toronto, and I thought I'd get him now that I have an opportunity for a few days. Walter's a longtime friend. I've known him 35, I think he says 36 years. And when I first met him, he was an undergraduate student in chemistry at the University of Toronto. And I think he got very interested in doing research on chemical surveillance of compliance with chemical weapons conventions and that sort of thing. I'm going to let him tell you about that in a second. But that was kind of the camel's nose under the tent, because after that he kind of kept sneaking in to do peace work more and more. And he's not much of a chemist anymore. I think he's a peace studies person primarily. He's teaching at the Canadian Forces College here in Toronto, where his students are all military officers. And he calls himself a sheep in wolf's clothing, because he is really a peaceman, but he is interested in things like peacekeeping, which does involve use of military force sometimes. So I now want to introduce you to my friend Walter Dorn. So say hi.
Warm greetings to you, Metta, and to your viewers. Glad to be with you and glad to share some ideas as we try and figure out how to bring a little more peace to this world.
Perfect. I guess you're in your office at the Canadian Forces College, and I see that you have Woodrow Wilson's bust behind you.
Yeah, I've done it double, because I both have his portrait on the wall and his bust on the table behind me. Woodrow Wilson was a kind of model for me. It was in those early days as an undergraduate that I realized the difference between narrow-minded nationalism and broad-minded internationalism when he fought for the creation of the first international organization. And he made World War I not only a war against something, but a war for something. And for that was trying to create the rule of law in the world. And despite his flaws, I still think that Woodrow Wilson has a message for today.
Mm-hmm. His goal was to make the world safe for democracy. Was that his word for it, or somebody else think of?
No, that's exactly it. When he called on Congress to do a war declaration against Germany, he gave his reasons, and he said on April 3rd, 1917, that the world should be made safe for democracy. And therefore he's calling upon America to give its blood and its treasure for those goals. And shortly thereafter, in January of 1918, he came out with the War Aims, which were his 14 points. And they included as the last point that a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the assurance of the territorial integrity and political independence of small and great nations alike.
So the dream, unfortunately, of the League of Nations, he wasn't able to fulfill. And only later we have the UN.
Right, but the vision from the League of Nations to the United Nations continued. In 1919, Wilson proposed the League of Nations. It was created in 1920, and he was actually the drafter. He was the last president to write his own speeches and write his own documents. So he had a major hand in drafting the covenant of the League of Nations. And if you actually looked at the covenant and the UN Charter that came in 1945, you'll see a continuum of ideas. In fact, the 14th point of political independence and territorial integrity carried over from Wilson's speech to the League of Nations covenant and then to the UN Charter in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter, which calls for the non-use of force against the political independence and territorial integrity of nations of the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we've leapt ahead because most of what you do nowadays seems to be connected with the United Nations. Your work on equipment for surveillance. I don't know, you must have a good snappy title for that kind of work. But at any rate, let's get to that later, because in the meantime, let's sort of go forward from your interest in chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, as it were. And tell us how you got involved with that kind of work and what you think about the status of the chemical weapons ban now?
Well, I was an undergraduate chemistry student who thought all professors were gods. And in fact, I'm much more wiser now about the capacity of professors. And I heard a talk at the University of Toronto by John Polanyi and Dick Garwin at Convocation Hall. And there were some 2,000 people in attendance, as there was a major concern from scientists and non-scientists alike about the dangers of nuclear war in the age of Ronald Reagan and the Soviet Union. And the talk was about how the United Nations could use satellites, reconnaissance satellites, to monitor the Earth for the verification of arms control treaties, for peace operations, for the environment, and for development. And this idea of an international satellite monitoring agency, or ISMA, really caught my attention. And I decided to write an article for the student newspaper. And while doing so, I interviewed John Polanyi in his office in the chemistry department. This was 1980.
John Polanyi, we should say, is a Nobel laureate, and I guess was at the time, right?
He hadn't yet won the Nobel Chemistry Prize. He got that in 1985 or 86, and this was 1982. So I was in his office in the University of Toronto and doing an interview on ISMA, the International Satellite Monitoring Agency. And he very kindly gave me some excellent quotes and ideas. And from that, I got an inspiration to follow the topic, which I did for a number of years, developing a bibliography of writings on the subject of ISMA. And then between my master's and my PhD, I took a year off and wrote a book called Peacekeeping Satellites, The Case for International Surveillance and Verification, published in 1987, and looking at this idea of an international satellite monitoring agency for the UN.
Well, it's a dandy idea in a lot of ways, but I don't see the connection to chemistry. I mean, how can you monitor chemical weapons with satellites?
Well, there is a connection because arms control can be done in part from outer space. You want to look at any chemical factories that are being built, any train lines being used to carry chemical weapons. This was before the time of the Chemical Weapons Convention being signed, which happened in 1993. And there were estimates that the Soviet Union had over 300,000 tons of chemical weapons. They needed facilities to store those weapons, to develop them, to disperse them, the means for missiles to carry those weapons. So it was a very strong component of major chemical armament being alleged. In the end, we discovered that the Soviet Union didn't have nearly as much as the U.S. estimates were. They had about 30,000 tons, about 10% of that those early estimates. But at the same time, those were major military facilities that could be monitored from outer space.
Okay, so we have now a chemical weapons convention, and all countries should by now have, destroyed all their stockpiles, right? I think the U.S. has not. Has any country actually done it, so as we know?
Yes, almost all the countries have now completed their stockpile destruction. That includes Russia, includes Canada. We had 18 tons of chemical weapons stored in Suffield. Russia had, as I mentioned, 30 to 35,000 tons of chemical weapons in its stockpile that were all destroyed and verified by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. And almost all nations of the world, including Libya and Syria, destroyed their chemical weapons stockpiles. Now, there may be some small amounts, let's say less than 1 ton in some countries, but the militarily significant stockpiles have been destroyed. So that was one of the great achievements of the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Mm-hmm. But I think the U.S. has not completed that, right?
The U.S. signed the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1983. In fact, I saw the Secretary of State, Eagleburger, sign it in Paris in 1993. And afterwards, I carried out that treaty with the signatures from the Secretaries of State and Foreign Ministers. I carried it out of the signing hall. And I sometimes joke that that was the time when I felt the real weight of international law. So the Chemical Weapons Convention was signed. The U.S. ratified it in 1997, and it has failed to live up to the provision in the Chemical Weapons Convention that it will destroy all its stockpile within first 10 years, and then it was an extension for another 10 years. And it has not yet completed that after 20 years. But at the same time, it made a vast amount of progress. It's destroyed thousands of tons of chemical weapons. It's just not completed within the deadline.
Do you think they're deliberately dragging their feet for political reasons, or are they just kind of tardy about getting on with it?
Well, I think the United States is being very deliberate about how it destroys it, and they're facing all kinds of obstacles. There's a lot of NIMBY, not in my backyard, from the facilities. One time they wanted to centralize the destruction, but that would require that the chemical weapons be transported by train or by truck or possibly by plane, and there was a lot of fear about that, so they created different chemical weapons destruction sites. And it's been a very slow and expensive process. The U.S. has spent over $20 billion in destruction. So it's a combination of not prioritizing it, but at the same time, there was a lot of local restraints and problems. So the Chemical Weapons Convention will be upheld with some flaws in the implementation by the United States.
Okay, let's look at ISMA. That idea sounded brilliant. It hasn't happened either, has it? But we have a lot of satellites up there. Are they doing substantially the work that ISMA would have done if you had got it to happen?
Yes, ISMA is happening in practice. Even though there's no international satellite monitoring agency, there are contracts that the UN has with different satellite providers, including a major contract with a Canadian company called McDonnell Detweiler, actually recently sold to recently established its headquarters in New York, in the United States. But there are many companies which are providing data to the UN from satellites, and those satellites are helping inform UN decisions on all the things that we were looking at, on the environment, on arms control, on peace operations, on conflict prevention, and the world has become much more transparent. And in fact, when I wrote the book in 1987, I couldn't have conceived at how cheap the imagery would become and how widespread that would be, although I was making predictions about that, and that the satellites would be in the hundreds in orbit, and that even private companies would be putting satellites into space. Even high schools can put satellites into space now, like the CubeSats that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you started going to the United Nations representing Science for Peace for many years. You're still the representative, I think. And you must have made some friends there, because you certainly have become engaged with and employed by the United Nations to do a whole bunch of different projects. You're out of the country much more than you're in, as far as I can tell. And you seem to always be working for the UN doing something. Is there a way of encapsulating what your role is, or what the types of jobs are that you have done for the UN?
Right. So, Metta, when you talk about friends that I've made at the UN, I've had some absolutely remarkable meetings, including with secretaries general and heads of state and foreign ministers. But one of the most remarkable meetings that I had was way back when, in 1982, when Professor Eric Fawcett, a physics professor at the University of Toronto, whom I later was a tutorial assistant in his thermal physics class, he brought me to the UN, and just outside the General Assembly, he pointed to a man in a wheelchair, and he said, "Do you happen to know Lord Philip Noel Baker?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, come on over, I'll introduce you to him." So I met him, and I established an immediate rapport for him, and that man was a link to the past. Lord Philip Noel Baker was one of the negotiators in Paris with Woodrow Wilson in 1919, and he helped draft the League of Nations Covenant. Then he became ambassador for disarmament. He was at the disarmament conference in 1933, really the last chance to bring Germany into the fold before Hitler would gain the reins in his vengeance against the West. And this was the last initiative to show the German people that yes, Germany can be accommodated, and that the flaws of the Treaty of Versailles could be remediated. Lord Philip Noel Baker had his own experience with chemical weapons. He was on the battlefield during the First World War when he saw a wall of blue-green gas coming towards him. in the fields in Europe and had to take cover from chemical weapons themselves. He went on to work for disarmament during the various British governments in Parliament and as ambassador, and he wrote a book about the efforts towards disarmament before the Second World War, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1950s for his lifelong work on disarmament. So here he was in 1982 at the third special session on disarmament, another world conference. Oh, sorry, it was the second special session on disarmament in 1982. And here he was towards the end of his life, encouraging a young peace activist like me. And in fact, in 1988, at the third special session on disarmament, I got an opportunity to address the General Assembly, its Committee on the Whole in the UN in New York, in favor of an International Satellite Monitoring Agency and a UN verification agency, and very much carrying the ideals that Lord Philip Noel Baker had at the very dawn of the conception and organization of international institutions for peace.
That's a good way to get a start, running into an inspiring man like that. Now that you're referring to UNSOD 2, we called it, right?
That's
I remember
correct.
that's the one where they had I was in that march. I don't think I did much at the UN as you were doing, but I certainly walked all the way up to Central Park in that 1 million-person march in support of that action there.
That's right, Metta. I was there as well. So we marched together from the United Nations to Central Park in one of the top or largest demonstrations in the history of the United States.
That's right. It was a wonderful day, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I still have some photos from it. Well, now let's move on. I asked you what you do for the UN because I know you've gone to places like you were in East Timor at the time that there was fighting going on to make East Timor independent from Indonesia, and you were protecting people. Can you give us an overview of your various roles in all these UN actions?
So I consider myself an operational academic. I try and get to the field as often as possible, try and work with the UN at UN headquarters. And over the years, I've had various roles as a consultant, as a field worker, as a peacekeeper, as an advisor at the International Criminal Court. And specifically in East Timor, I was there as a UN electoral monitor. I had responsibility over several polling stations where we did the UN supervised election. I should say, actually, it was a referendum called popular consultation at the time. And we gave the people, the long-suffering people of East Timor, a chance after 450 years of colonialism and occupation, 24 years of Indonesian occupation, to give them a chance to determine their own future. So we were educating the Timorese on their options for the referendum, whether they stay integrated within Indonesia, as was the de facto government of Indonesia in 1999, or whether they get to create their own country and have independence. And I was in polling stations. I had various teams to run those polling stations. And in fact, I chose some polling sites, and one of them was not appreciated by the militia in East Timor that were Indonesian government-led militia. And I was told that my advice or my decision on a polling station was wrong, and that the militia could no longer guarantee my security or that of my team. So I generally worried about the people that were under my care. The UN decided to end up moving that polling station, and thankfully, because of the actions of peacekeepers, that threat was withdrawn, and I could move freely in Timor. But I'm afraid to say that when the result was announced, within hours there was a killing that went on after the Timorese decided some 78% in favor of independence. The Indonesian government exacted its retribution on the people and wanted to show the rest of Indonesia that there would be a price if you decided to separate. And so there was a massacre at one of the places where I had done voter education, the Ave Maria Church, and unfortunately one of the members of my team died in that massacre. So I still bear the scars of that, but also the intervention in Australia And the independence, which came after a 2-year transitional administration, was also a glorious moment that showed me that some of the pain was well worth it, and that the UN could actually do something very significant, and that I could be part of history as the half island of Timor, East Timor, gained its independence and became the 192nd member of the United Nations. And its flag was brought up on First Avenue in New York City, a flag that, while I was there, could not be shown to me because it was illegal at the time.
Mm-hmm. I remember when you came back, you were shaken very much.
I was shaken, and I probably would have had post-traumatic stress disorder, except for the fact that the reign of terror lasted only about 10 days before the U.S. put so much pressure on Indonesia to allow a peacekeeping force to come in. And Australia was ready for that, to lead that force. And Interfet, the international force in East Timor, arrived and was able to take over responsibilities from the Indonesian military. And we saw a smooth transition to democracy through a transitional administration where the UN governed the territory for a period of about 2 years.
Okay, so now one of the things I know you've done a lot of is look at ways, well, I guess the international satellite monitoring idea was sort of a precursor of the larger idea of developing technologies that would be useful for verification or for other kinds of surveillance activities carried out by UN peacekeepers, right? And you've written books about this, and I'm surprised that you don't have your toys around you, because I know that one time you gave us a talk that I had organized, and you brought a whole bunch of little things that you passed around among the audience, including a drone that flew around the room, and I think it bumped into the walls. But at any rate, that maybe you better have better drones today. I don't know. But you had various kinds of funny cameras and so on. Tell us about that whole notion that the UN can be made more effective in its operations, in peacekeeping activities, if they have the right kind of equipment.
Right. So, Metta, you're right. I did write a book. It was called Keeping Watch, Monitoring and Surveillance Technologies in UN Peace Operations. And I did that during a sabbatical in 2010. And as a result of that book, the UN asked me if I would think it would be a good idea to form a panel of experts and if I would join it. So I did. In 2014, we released our report called Performance Peacekeeping. And that report then pushed the UN to use more modern technology. And I'm pleased to say that in the last 5 years, I've seen more progress in the UN's use of technology than the previous 25 years.
So you can take credit for some of that.
I was part of that process, and indeed during my last sabbatical, I took half a year to serve as the UN's technology and innovation, protection technology and innovation expert. And the UN sent me to field missions in Central African Republic and Mali and Democratic Republic of Congo, and the UN's regional office in Entebbe, a regional support center in Entebbe. So I looked at these missions and evaluated their technologies, and I saw that they were making progress, and I made recommendations on how to make more progress. And I certainly included satellite surveillance, but I also included unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, looked at ground sensors, and then the broader range of technologies for power generation, for environmental protection, for early warning, and for community alert networks. How can cell phones be better used so that communities can sound the alarm and improve the effectiveness of UN intervention for the protection of civilians.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so already you've got some of these things being used in Africa now. And what are the most promising, which of your toys are you fondest of? Because you find it has been very effective. What is really, really, really useful?
Well, the eye in the sky in the form of UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles has seen a revolution. You're quite right that the early models, like the toys that I was exhibiting, they have been really surpassed, and every year they've grown better. And now the UN can use technologies that were toys previously as real assets to make a difference on the ground. And I've already seen them help mobilize peacekeepers in the field, be used for engineering projects for the UN. I've seen them being used for monitoring of refugees and convoys. I've seen them for overhead protection when the UN is on the move. There's just so many uses for these technologies where the drones can cost less than $2,000 a piece. And I've also seen much more sophisticated drones, the medium altitude, long endurance drones, or MALE drones that are used through satellite links. And these are used for long-range patrols, detection of IEDs on roads in places like Mali. They are proven very useful for weather detection, for the overhead surveillance when troops are on the ground and they want to know what's happening over the next hill or what's happening in the environment in case they could come under ambush or attack. These are extremely useful assets. And the UN is still grappling with the means for information collation, information storage, and retrieval so that we can do better long-term analyses and change detection. But I have to say that there's been tremendous progress over the last few years, and the UN finally is using airborne assets in a way that can make peacekeeping more effective.
Tell me, is anybody working on drones that can fetch things for you? And my reason, I have a complicated reason, because in another couple of weeks, I'm going to do an interview with somebody in Oxford, England, and some other folks who are specializing in planting trees with drones on a big scale, because I think we really, really, really need to plant about 1 trillion trees if we're going to use it as a carbon sink. That can be the most promising carbon sink. Anyway, people I've talked to who are foresters say that it's really important to get the right kind of seeds. Well, if you want to go find old growth seeds way the hell off the road, way places you couldn't walk in there, and it would be lovely if we could just send a drone and say, would you pluck some acorns from all of the old growth oaks over there and bring them home, and we will use them in our tree planting drone. But I haven't yet heard of a drone that, one guy says he's working on a drone that will fetch him a beer from the fridge. But apart from that, I think I haven't heard of anybody saying that they could do something like go pick acorns for us.
Right. So the UN is actually looking very deeply and actually already has some applications where drones are used to transport things. Most of the area is, as you've said, in the area of ecology and the environment. But they're also being used for transportation of medicines to some remote stations, things where they're very hard to get to. In fact, we often talk about the drones being used for the 3Ds, dull work, denied work, or what third D?
Dull work.
Dull, dirty, and denied. Yeah. So the D, another is dirty, something that can really be messy. And I would include dangerous if you want a fourth D. So especially in peacekeeping, where you might have the peacekeepers not wanting to get too close to combat, they can observe from the air. But to get back to your point about transport, there could be lots of opportunities for peacekeeping to transport aid and drop them. They already use helicopters.
Well, they drop them already. Even I think Amazon is going to be delivering things, but they don't pick things up and bring them. They don't fetch things, do they?
You're right. So the fetching is a step beyond, but even dropping from drones, there are very few examples of that. It's just the prototype stage. It's not being regularized. And Amazon certainly made a name for itself by advertising that they would be doing that, but we're a long way from actually seeing Amazon do that in our front yards.
Oh, okay. Too bad. Yeah. All right. So, well, okay, that's great. And you have another book that you've done on this. You've done 2 books on surveillance and peacekeeping equipment, haven't you?
That's correct. The first one was called Peacekeeping Satellites, the Case for International Surveillance and Verification. The second was Keeping Watch, Technology and Innovation in UN Peacekeeping. And since we were talking about the use of UN air power, I've written a book about that. called UN Air Power Wings for Peace.
I don't think I've seen that book. So give us a précis.
Okay, so it can be found online at www.unairpower.net. And I looked at the history of the use of air power for the things that we were mentioning, for transport, for reconnaissance, for combat, and for relaying signals, and the basic functions, that is to carry things, to observe things, and to shoot. And I looked at those cases in UN history, and as an edited volume, brought in authors who brought great value to look at the cases in history and look to the future too about how this capacity for air power can be used for peace.
Okay, now let's talk about pugwash, because we'll do that before I get into the peacekeeping business, if that's all right with you. And
sure.
We might also want to talk about the World Federalist Movement, which you are now the head of in Canada. But let's talk about, I don't know, what do you want to do first? Pugwash, I think. You were chair of the Canadian Pugwash Group for what, 6 or 8 years?
Yep, 6 years, 3 2-year terms.
Yeah. Okay. People need to know a little bit about what pugwash is and why. Are we doing anything worthwhile? I'm a member, by the way.
Sure. So pugwash was founded at the behest of Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell. In fact, the last letter that Albert Einstein signed was to call on scientists to meet somewhere in the world to deal with the threat of weapons of mass destruction. So it was a call to the people who had helped develop weapons of mass destruction to be able to find ways that they could be controlled and eventually eliminated. And it was in a small fishing village in Pugwash, Nova Scotia in 1957 that call was answered by scientists who gathered there and in response to the Russell-Einstein Manifesto decided to reach across the East-West divide, and including nuclear scientists from both the Soviet Union and the United States. And they agreed to look at ways in which scientists can contribute towards creating better peace in the world and dealing with disarmament. And then they met in many conferences ever since, and they formed national groups that would support the Pugwash principles. And the Canadian one was established by John Polanyi, the same person I mentioned earlier who had so much influence on me in my undergraduate, including my last graduate course, which was co-taught by John Polanyi on reaction kinetics and dynamics. And John Polanyi established the Canadian Pugwash Group and handed over the reins to a series of chairs. And I ended up, after joining in the early 90s and becoming part of the Canadian Pugwash Board in 1995, shortly before Pugwash International won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 on the anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And I am still serving on the board since 1995 and was chair for 6 years. Now we're continuing that same call. We're calling out to scientists, and we're trying to respond to that call by figuring out ways in which science can be used for peace and finding out ways that the misuses of science for weapons of mass destruction can be prevented. And so it's a call both for positive and negative applications of science.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth mentioning that during the Cold War, the relations between the Russian members and the Western members was very important. And the Russian Pugwashites, many of them were very high profile, high influential people in Parliament, the Duma. And they were able to go home and influence policies very dramatically under, especially I think the ABM Treaty. They had a lot of influence on getting that through. Anyway, we needn't go into the Pugwash, but now let's skip ahead and talk about your interest now in the World Federalist Movement before we talk about the peacekeeping, because that's where we're going to get into thicker issues, I think. You're the head of the World Federalist Movement in Canada, right?
That's correct. I'm president of WFMC.
And?
So the World Federalist Movement really comes out of the spirit of internationalism, of humanity. And as I like to tell my officers that I teach at the Canadian Forces College, I really admire the military's principle of a country before self, that one should be willing to sacrifice themselves for the better good of the country. And I add that I also believe in humanity above country, that we should look at the welfare of our human species above the narrow-minded nationalism for our country. And so this spirit of humanity, of wanting to serve humanity and act with our own humanity in the spirit of the Russell Einstein Manifesto, is really the highest calling that I can feel for a career, and that I hope to respond to, and hence the work for the United Nations. And the World Federalist Movement really has that call at heart. It believes that internationalism in the spirit of our common humanity should form the primary interest of our endeavors, and that we should move the world forward, not just by our national initiatives, but by creating global solutions to global problems. That means creating international institutions that can actually deal with the international problems. And the United Nations is a really important stepping stone towards a world that's more effectively governed. And global governance requires not just the progress from the League to the UN, but progress from the UN to some sort of world federation. And that's where the World Federalist Movement has its dream, that at some point we'll have a truly democratic with federation with proper checks and balances and legal oversight over executive authority, and that the United Nations is the best route to move towards that better world. And so we actively support the strengthening of the United Nations, and eventually its transformation or its evolution or revolution into a form of global governance that can actually solve the global problems that we see in the world today.
You know, I did a bit of a talk show with Fergus Watt a few months ago and was trying to pry some secrets out of him. They're not really secrets, but he wasn't very forthcoming about what his plans were, because I understand that he's kind of in charge of a group at the United Nations that is looking for a plan to put forward in the year 2020, which would be an anniversary of the UN, for some kind of reform or some structural changes. So he wasn't very willing to tell me what the plans were. I guess he doesn't really have any yet, but he's in the process of trying to get people to think together about what needs to be done. And it seems to me that one of the first things that needs to be done is work toward a parliamentary assembly. That is, getting another house in the UN besides the General Assembly and the Security Council, but have it be more representative in some way. And I talked to various people about that. I even mentioned it to Doug Roach a while back, and he said, well, you couldn't really have direct elections of people in every country of the world to send, choose delegates to go to a parliamentary assembly. The best that you could do to start off with would be for them to send the people they've already elected to their own legislatures and so on. And but then there are all kinds of interesting questions about how many delegates each country will get, and all the mathematics weight into the equation a number of factors like the population and the needs, and I don't know. What do you think about the whole parliamentary assembly idea? And if we got it, what are the odds that we could get them to the Security Council to give up the veto, or at least promise to not overuse it or something?
Right. So I think that the Parliamentary Assembly is a brilliant idea that could very easily be implemented. It would simply require that the members of Parliament assemble in New York, the selected members of Parliament, as chosen by their parliaments, assemble in New York at the seats of the governments that are already in the General Assembly Hall, and that they discuss matters as parliamentarians. They are, in most cases, elected by the people, either directly or indirectly, although we want to see that improve in the world. And they could begin to pass resolutions like the General Assembly, and that over time they would acquire more powers, and that eventually we'd have a parliamentary assembly that would have powers that are similar to the General Assembly, or perhaps even similar to the Security Council. And this assembly could be incorporated into the UN Charter eventually, but there's nothing wrong with it starting to meet in coming years as simply as representatives of parliaments, of the legislative branches of government, instead of being representatives of the executive branches of governments always meeting in New York. I think that's only one thing, and Fergus Watt is really at the forefront of pushing a wide range of things. We World Federalists have nothing to hide and everything to share. We seek UN Parliamentary Assembly as stepping stones, similar to the European Parliament. But we also have many more areas we'd like to see progress, and Fergus will tell you that it's not about black helicopters or the creating global government. We want to see checks and balances in the international system, so we could have judicial review of Security Council decisions by the International Court of Justice.
I haven't heard of that plan.
Sure.
Is that part of this 2020 proposal in the works?
Some people have that as part of 2020, and 2020 is significant because it's the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and there's an opportunity to do some long-term thinking. The League of Nations was only lasted from 1920 to 45, or 46, so about a quarter of a century. Now we've seen 3/4 of a century under the UN, and we can take the long-term view. 100 years ago, we didn't even have an international organization for peace. So where do we want to go in the next 100 years? That's really important to look at how the evolution of international organization can take place. And if you measure the yardstick of the past, we should be able to dream about much greater things than what we've achieved in the last 100 years. So parliamentary assembly, so a reform of the Security Council, restraints on the Security Council veto, the creation of greater powers for the UN Secretary General, the ability to have monitoring within nation states, perhaps in open skies for the United Nations, the Secretary General's rights for fact-finding missions in countries, the automaticity of international law, legal enforcement, the promotion of sanctions that are monitored by genuine international actors, and the check on enforcement powers by the enforcement authorities on the Security Council, so that we have responsibility while protecting, and we have responsibilities of the Secretary General to monitor and report on enforcement operations, to make sure that responsibility to protect is done in a way that's consistent with the UN Charter. All of these are areas where the UN could have fantastic responsibilities in the future that can really make our planet more safer, not just for the countries where there are human rights violations, but by those who want to enforce international law.
Perfect. Boy, you gave me an armload of good answers. It looks like somebody's been busy since I talked to Fergus Watt, because these are much more precise than he was able to say at the time. That's great. Now, the only thing I didn't hear you mention is taxes. What is the idea of getting some system of collecting taxes for the UN directly?
Right. So the member states of the UN have been rather miserly in funding of the UN. The UN regular budget is about $2 billion a year. It's less than the police departments of most big cities in the Western world. You can look at peacekeeping with a budget of $6 billion, less than 0.1% of the defense expenditures worldwide. We just have to find other means for bringing the necessary resources to things like peace operations, to the Secretary General's fact-finding missions, and to all the range of activities that the UN does in the field. And it's important to create means that the UN can be directly gaining revenue sources that are not under the stranglehold of certain member states, particularly the major powers that pay the most amount of money, but also are in arrears in their dues and put conditions on their funding. So we explore those kind of options. It could be something like the Tobin tax, a certain small percentage of tax on international financial transactions would help bring the wild swings in currency exchanges, dampen them, and all at the same time give direct funding to worthwhile UN projects under very strict accounting principles. We could also look at international airfares. 0.1% tax on international airfares would go a long way, or $1 per airplane ticket, so that we could begin to fund things like making sure that airports are up to standards and that we have the means to secure international airspace and make sure that the rules governing air transport or the aerial transport of goods can be made better for the World Food Program or for other programs and agencies like the International Civil Aviation Organization located in Montreal. These are all ideas that where such a small percentage could make big difference for the security of our world, and I think would end up paying back to the world much more than you'd be costing in the original place, and help make the world more secure and freer from war, so that people could live in more harmony. The world economy could grow faster, especially in marginalized areas like Africa. And we could see the UN have real means to put real capacities into the field with these international forms of revenue.
You're blowing me away. It's wonderful. I agree with everything you said. As a matter of fact, almost everything you've said is already in one of the planks or another of the platform for survival that we, as part of this project Save the World, are promoting. And I'm all in favor of that. Now, one you didn't mention is a plank called the United Nations Emergency Peace Service. And that is really connected to, and it sounds to me like kind of an elaboration of peacekeeping idea already, only maybe an improvement on it, because I think personally that one of the greatest problems in the world today that we have to deal with is simply cutting back on militarism. I think that, most countries have arms that they should not have anything like that size weaponry. And if they did, then we would get rid of some of the causes of global warming and we'd solve a lot of other problems. But you're not going to get anybody to let go of their army unless you have some other guarantee of security in case they're invaded. So that's where I think the notion of the United Nations Emergency Peace Service could be very helpful, because it could kind of offer reassurance that if anything happens, we will come and take care of you and protect you. So that is a proposal that has been around for a while. And tell me, if you will, how the idea would be that the United Nations would have its own peace service, which wouldn't just be peacekeepers, but also people who could do mediation and conflict, work and that kind of thing. Every time there's a hot spot. Compare that to what exists now in the peacekeeping business. I know that half of what you do in your profession is to teach people about peacekeeping, or that you have been very critical of the Canadian government for having gone to sleep on the job and not being as engaged with peacekeeping as we were 30, 40, 50 years ago. So do a little comparison between this ambitious idea of a UN emergency peace service and the kinds of activities that actually go on now by way of peacekeeping.
Sure. So peacekeeping has evolved considerably in the activities that they do, from the early unarmed observer missions to the peacekeeping forces that Lester Pearson proposed in 1956, to the multidimensional missions that we saw proliferate after the end of the Cold War. And because of that proliferation, we have many civilians who are full-time peacemakers. They help warring parties to come to the negotiating table, as they're doing now in Yemen and have done in dozens of cases to help bring peace in the world. And we've seen an expansion of peacekeeping responsibilities in implementing peace accords, including the introduction of police into peacekeeping missions, And now the UN even has some police who are permanently employed by the UN to form a kind of standby police service. So that is a part of the evolution, and I believe that eventually we should have some standing peace and police and peacekeepers, military peacekeepers, who actually work full-time for the United Nations. At the present time, the peacekeepers that are military are deployed from nation states. They get their training in the nation states and a little bit with the UN. And when they're deployed in the field, they are acting under UN operational control, but they still under sovereign command from their nations. Now, if the UN were to create a standing military force, I would be happy to sign up for one. I would like to see it under proper checks and balances and under control of the UN organs and operational control of the UN Secretary General, but with the properly mandated, proper mandates from their respective bodies. There are steps towards that. Before we get to standing forces, we can look at standby forces. And that means that nation states will pledge to the UN, as they do under the PCRS, Peacekeeping Capability Readiness System, that they will have forces on standby, including short notice standby, to be deployed by the UN. And I hope that Canada and other nations can create a standby capability service that they can pledge to, including PCRS, but also something like Sherbrig, which existed in the 2000s. And that wasn't much used, but which was a significant step towards training for peacekeeping. And this kind of standby forces can help the UN deploy forces more quickly when they're needed. And eventually, you'd have a much faster reaction if the UN actually had forces that were permanently employed by the UN, probably stationed in the member states which are helping to train them and give them barracks and the capacity for proper civilian control under international authority. And we'd see this UNEPS, the UN Emergency Peace Service, become a significant reality sometime in the 21st century with small amounts, first with restricted mandates to be involved in things that you mentioned, like peacemaking, the negotiation of peace agreements, the support of peace agreements, the protection of civilians, like mandates we already have, and eventually take on more robust activities as they've proven themselves trustworthy and responsible and under the strict and effective international control. And then we could see the UN actually have armed forces under its disposal to deal with some of the more egregious violations of international law by certain armed groups, terrorist groups and the like. And in a few centuries from now, we'll actually see international force under international authority being used to secure the peace of the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now I don't have any problem with that, but I did say that we'll deal with the most, if there's a controversy, it would come last. And there are controversies about the proper role of peacekeeping or peacekeepers. And I know that there are terms under the UN Charter for peace enforcement operations. But a few years ago, when there was a lot of controversy about the fact, which you were instigating this controversy yourself more than anybody else, I think, about the fact that the Canadian government has just given up practically on peacekeeping. Some people have said, well, that's because the era of peacekeeping is really over. You don't have peacekeeping opportunities along the lines that we had in the earliest days, when the peacekeepers had to be invited by a country in order to be allowed to come in, and when the country was already agreeable to whatever peace actions they wanted to put forward. But because nowadays what you have is really the peacekeepers are war fighters. They are fighting on behalf of one side or another, rather than intervening between two sides and trying to keep the two sides from fighting each other. And, there's certainly cases, well, it's mostly NATO that does that kind of thing, but nevertheless, a lot of the military interventions abroad nowadays do seem to resemble warfighting operations rather than the classical notion of peacekeeping. So having this little hot potato, can I toss it in your lap?
Sure, gladly take it. As I mentioned, peacekeeping has evolved from the observer missions to interposed forces between governments, between states on their borders, to multidimensional missions, and now they have robust mandates for the protection of civilians. That is, if there are imminent threats to physical harm by the civilian population, the new missions have the right to intervene once they're already deployed in the country, of course, with the consent of the host state and the main parties of the conflict. Now that evolution has caused the UN, dilemmas on when to use force, and that's certainly a controversial area. But the UN is more robust now than they ever have been, and I'm very pleased to say that there are times when they actually can intervene when civilians are being killed in order to prevent that killing, and that has been done in cases in Mali and Central African Republic and Democratic Republic of Congo, where combat forces were used in combat in order to prevent atrocities, in order to deal with people who are committing massacres. The need for peacekeeping is as great as ever. The Secretary General has approximately 100,000 uniformed personnel deployed in the field. That's far greater than the Cold War, far greater during classical peacekeeping. That is the largest deployer of armed forces on operations in the world, more than the U.S. military deploys on operations currently. So it's become, for the last 10 years or so, the largest deployer of forces in the world on operations. And that shows the myth that peacekeeping is dead, that very much peacekeeping is alive. It's been reduced under the Trump administration. The budget's been reduced by $500 million out of the $7.9 billion to $7.3 billion, and there might be some further cuts. But the need is great there, and there will be, I envisage, future missions in Syria and in Yemen and possibly in Libya and other places which desperately need these kind of operations. And the need is there for Western countries to step up to the plate and do some of the heavy lifting. That the majority of peacekeeping has been done by the developing world, and they have made tremendous sacrifices in their national blood and treasure, although the UN does reward them with substantial funding that in the Western standards wouldn't meet the Western expenditures, but in some developing world countries it actually meets their expenditures. But
do they do a good job? Do these folks from where are they mostly from? What are the main?
About half of the peacekeepers now are from Africa, and another good quarter are from South Asia. And the West contributes about 20% of the peacekeepers. But the peacekeeping is not yet done to the level that's required to meet the mission mandates, which are extremely ambitious. And the West has actually shirked its responsibility to do some of the heavy lifting. So most of the fatalities are being suffered by the developing world. And there are some very brave soldiers from the developing world who are putting their lives and making the ultimate sacrifice to deal with threats in places like Mali, where over 100 peacekeepers have died since 2013 in malicious attacks against peacekeepers.
Well, Canada sent some peacekeepers there, but I haven't heard a word about what they're doing. What are they doing?
Well, Canada has chosen to do the safer tasks in Mali. They haven't yet taken on the more dangerous ones. They're providing aeromedical evacuation and transport jobs done from helicopters or Chinooks and escorted by Griffin helicopters. And this is done as a very valuable contribution to the UN mission in Mali. And I commend Canada for doing that. And there is certain danger, although the risk in Mali is less than a quarter of what the risk was in Afghanistan. In fact, I would say probably less than a tenth of the risk. If you measure the fatality rates, it's a small fraction of the risks that we took in other parts of the world.
That's interesting because there was a lot of kerfuffle about when the mission was announced. It was called the most dangerous mission that anybody could come up with, but you're thinking it's really not.
No, the facts show otherwise. In fact, if you look at the number of Western fatalities since the mission was created in 2013, the number is precisely one soldier who has died under malicious attack in Mali since 2013. So this is a myth that it's a threat to Western forces. Properly prepared, Western forces face very little threat. And I've been to northern Mali, to Tessalit, and to Timbuktu, and to Kidal and Gao, and I've seen the operations there, and I'd be very willing to go back there and work under those conditions in the UN. It's not free of risk, but it is definitely not the risk that's been portrayed by some elements in the Canadian political system and worldwide. It may be the most dangerous UN mission, but it's nothing in comparison to the danger that existed in places like Afghanistan for Western forces. And again, it's the developing countries that are taking the majority of the risk. It's time for Western countries to actually put their boots on the ground to do long-range patrols like the Dutch are doing and the Swedes have done, and the Germans are doing now. And those are the leading countries, and it's time for Canada and other Western nations to really show commitment and to do some smart pledging to work with other countries in a way that can guarantee the UN long-term, sustainable contributions from member states with key enablers like Canada has, whether it be the helicopters or the radars or the armored personnel carriers, kind of things that are necessary to really bring about peace in these war-torn areas of the world where a well-trained military capability is there. And Canada has said that it was going to re-engage in peacekeeping, but Trudeau government brought Canada to an all-time low in less than a year ago. We had only 19 military peacekeepers and 20 police peacekeepers. Now with the Mali mission, we've gone to about 300 or less than 300 peacekeepers, uniformed peacekeepers in the field. The UN mission desperately needs Canadian contributions, and Canada has been very selective. We are no longer the prolific peacekeeper that we once were. We were once the top peacekeeper in the world. Now we're somewhere in the 50s. Canada had at its peak 3,300 Canadian forces deployed on peacekeeping operations, and now we're less than 10% of that. And in fact, the Trudeau government has provided on average during its tenure less than the number of peacekeepers that the Harper government had deployed, and much less than previous Liberal governments under Martin and Chrétien, and certainly during the times of the periods where Canada was the #1 peacekeeper. So Canada's been very slow. We pledged a quick reaction force, but that quick reaction force hasn't come in the last 2 years, and we're dithering and delaying. And the UN has very patiently waited for Canada to supply leadership and force enablers. We had 6 force commanders and mission commanders in the 1990s, but in the last 18 years, we haven't provided any in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So the UN is waiting, but Canada has yet to really step up to the plate and show that it can become a solid, dependable partner in peacekeeping.
Okay, that's a real sermon. You really have, you put it out there, and let's hope somebody who has decision-making power in Ottawa hears you. And I know you've been publishing things like this in the Globe and Mail for ages, trying to influence public opinion and influence the government to do more peacekeeping. Well, our time is up. And so I have to thank you very quickly and go let you off for the evening. It's been fun. It always is so much fun. And I have to express my extreme admiration for you, Walter. It's not only that you're a great guy, but you're a smart man and you're a very prolific scholar and your heart is in the right place and you're doing all the good things. So bless you. I'll see you later.
Well,
Okay.
thank you, Metta, for doing this. The admiration is definitely mutual because, since you founded the Peace Calendar and in the early 1980s, found you to be an inspiration for our activities for peace in Canada, and now you have global reach through your podcasts and through these recordings. And I think that you're doing a marvelous thing as you're well into your 80s. You've been a model for me, and I hope I can be as prolific and as dynamic as you are.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so see you soon, friends. Okay,
see you.
bye.
Okay. Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.